Okay, this is a video lecture for Chapter 3 of the Criminological Theory, Context, and Consequences textbook. This chapter covers some theories that came out of what we call the Chicago School, and then some theories that kind of came after that. Just so you know, this chapter covers a lot of the, there are some major theories that it covers, and there are some that are kind of sideline theories. In this lecture, I'm just going to cover most of the major points on the biggest theories that you need to know, but you'll still need to go through the rest of the chapter and just be familiar with some of the things that aren't covered here. As the United States entered the 20th century, there were a lot of new ideas about crime that started to come into being. As you've read already in the classical school, it was decided that man was a rational creature and that he weighed consequences and costs and pursued pleasure and avoided pain. And then we kind of moved to the positivist school, where we started to see crime as being more determined by maybe someone's physical characteristics, psychological characteristics, and then we kind of moved to characteristics of society. That was kind of the big push in the early 20th century and even onto the mid 20th century. And a lot of these theories I'm talking about in this chapter really still persist today as major theories of criminology that have a lot of support and have a lot of good things to say. One of the things that characterized the last half of the 1800s was really rapid growth in cities. And one of the cities that was grew particularly quickly was Chicago. And because it grew so quickly, it kind of became a focal point for a lot of this type of research. The statistics you can see there from 1833 to 1910, the population in Chicago went from a little over 4,000 people to over 2 million. So it's and the thing is, most of the people that came to Chicago were not wealthy people. They were immigrants, people without a lot of resources and not a lot of money. Because if you think about it, at the time, in the early 1800s or mid 1800s, Chicago was kind of on the western edge of what was then the United States. So it was kind of the frontier, and so a lot of people that came to the United States from other countries, a lot of them went west and ended up settling in some of these cities. And Chicago became a major hub, and a lot of people settled there, and you can see the kind of population growth that they experienced there. So in the 1920s and 1930s, the criminologists who were looking at all these changes in populations noticed a couple of things. Is that in these big cities where you had these population explosions, what you ended up having were these really large slum kind of areas. And these tended to be areas that were pretty high in crime. So criminologists and sociologists started to believe that growing up in one of these slum type areas in these large cities had to have some kind of impact on how people grew up and the kind of people they became and what types of activities they engaged in. The progressive movement, again, this group of researchers, this is what they were called, the people that were looking at these issues, really saw that people who grew up in these poor areas of large cities really had very low likelihood of breaking out of that area and getting into what we would consider an economically stable life. So in these cities you saw persistent disadvantage, and that usually led to people engaging in lives of crime at a higher rate than as compared to more wealthy areas. And so this kind of spawned this whole research movement to examine variables at the community level to see what it was that was driving these trends when you look at the makeup of the community. The basic premise behind what the progressive researchers believed is that the poor people were pushed into lives of crime by their environment. So it wasn't necessarily that these people had character flaws or they were bad people or anything like that. It was just that because of the environment they lived in, it was believed that this had to influence the likelihood of them getting involved in crime. So when you think about policy implications of that belief, essentially the goal became to, quote, save the poor by providing social services that would reduce poverty and help them to become more like middle class types of people. And of course, these kinds of programs have varying degrees of success. You might be able to help some people, but of course you can look around and see that these kinds of programs have not eradicated these kinds of poor areas in our communities by a long shot. At the University of Chicago, a researcher came along named Robert Park, and he was just one of many prominent researchers that did a lot of work in this area. And because these people all came from the University of Chicago, we refer to this group of researchers or this batch of research as the Chicago School. So again, not very creatively named, because but that's what it's called. So, but Robert Park concluded by looking at crime and looking at maps of the city and where crime was occurring, that development and organization of the city was not random. That there were basic social processes going on, and then as an extension of that, through these social processes, that also kind of determined the distribution of crime. Because as we've talked about before, crime is not evenly distributed throughout a community. It tends to have pockets where it's very concentrated, and then there might be other areas where there's almost none, and then you have other pockets around. And so what these researchers wanted to look at is, what are the social processes going on that would cause crime to be clustered in that way. So after Robert Park, we have Shaw and McKay who came along, who were another team of researchers, and you may have heard of them before if you've had the Intro to Theory class, which you should have. But Shaw and McKay are most noted for their work on what we call social disorganization theory. And this was an extension of the work of Robert Park, and they wanted to take a look at how they developed this concept of social organization or social disorganization in explaining the occurrence of crime. This map here is actually done by a researcher named Burgess. He had this concentric zone theory, and Shaw and McKay kind of used some of this in their theory. But essentially what you see here is, again, kind of looks like a target. But these concentric circles that you see are intended to denote areas that had different crime rates and different economic conditions. Now, one of the kind of interesting problems with this is that if you know anything about Chicago, you know that the city sits right alongside of a river. And so on this map that you see in front of you here, the right side of that line is really all water. So what they had to do was draw these concentric circles as if the river weren't there. Now, of course, it is there. But this was their way of trying to project, what this would look like. So just keep that in mind. But the very center that you see there is the urban area. That's the city center. The business buildings, office buildings, that kind of stuff. And back in the early to mid 1800s, this is where there was a lot of manufacturing jobs centered, and so that's where those were located. The very next zone out from there, zone 2, is what was called the transition zone, and this really is the zone where it was thought that crime would be the highest, because this tends to be the most dilapidated housing, the most economically depressed area, and so it was hypothesized that this is where you would find the highest crime rate. When you go out from there, Zone 3, this is where working class people would live, and then Zone 4 would be kind of what we would call like the suburbs, and then Zone 5, even farther out from that, would be where commuters come in from the further out suburbs. But essentially what the theory was with this is that the further you got out from the city center, the lower the crime rate would be. And so they actually mapped it, and they tracked it, and they tried to see if this was actually true. And some of the early work they did, they found that this was in fact the case, that you had the highest crime rates in that transition zone, and as you moved further out, the crime rates would go down. So just summarizing Burgess's theory, he had the cities divided into these 5 concentric zones, and it was really competition for jobs and competition for resources that determined how people are distributed in these zones. And the transition zone, that Zone 2, was really the one that they had the biggest concern with because of the deteriorating housing, high levels of displaced residents. And when immigrants would come into the city, they were the ones with the least resources, and they would come into these transition zones, and that would be where you'd find the highest crime rates. So when Sean McKay did their work on disorganization and juvenile delinquency, they mapped this distribution of crime in Chicago to see if it conformed with Burgess's concentric zone theory. And like I said already, it in fact did. They found that you could actually map these zones as you got further away from the city center. And the relationship they found is that the delinquency was inversely related to the zone's affluence. And so what that means is that the higher the rate of delinquency, usually the poorer the area was. The more wealthy an area was, usually the lower levels of delinquency they tended to have. Now, there are a couple things you have to be careful of here. This does not mean that being poor causes crime. That's there's really a very weak relationship when you look at poverty and crime at the individual level. So you cannot say that because someone is poor, they're going to be a criminal, because there are a lot of poor people out there who are not criminals. So you can't really say that that's causal. But being poor creates a lot of other circumstances that might lead you to a life of crime, at least more likely to. The other thing you need to keep in mind with this theory is that this is a macro level theory. It's looking at, really what this theory predicts is crime rates. It does not predict an individual's criminality. So you cannot say that because someone comes from an economically depressed area, or they live in transition zone 2 or whatever, you cannot say that, well, this individual person is more likely to commit crime. You just can't do that. It's called an ecological fallacy. You cannot make statements about individuals based on community level variables. The only statements you can make from community level variables are statements about the community. And so what this theory really predicts is not individual criminality, but it predicts community level crime rates. And so that they found is that was the case, that the further you moved out from the center of the city, the higher the crime rate was. Now, you can't impute individual characteristics from that, like I said, but you just need to understand. Now, the other thing that was interesting about this transition zone they talked about is that it didn't really matter which ethnic or racial group occupied that area at any given time. The higher crime rate in that area persisted regardless of whether it was occupied by the Chinese immigrants, black immigrants, Italian immigrants. It didn't matter. Whichever ethnic or racial group happened to be there, that was always the zone with the highest crime rate. So that kind of leads us to believe that you can't really even say that like race predicts crime rates, because a lot of people like to get wrapped up in talking about the black ghettos, that's where all the crime is. crimes, and people start getting the idea, well, there must be something about black people that causes them to have a higher crime rate. That is not true. If you put any group in this situation of economic disadvantage, that group will tend to have a higher crime rate, regardless of who they are. Because the other finding from these studies was that as these groups would progress economically and move to an area outside of the transition zone, they didn't take the crime with them. When they got to this better zone, they kind of fit into the lower crime rates of that area. So it's kind of interesting. So looking at, just kind of reviewing maybe what I've already explained a little bit, is that this theory of Sean McKay's really looked at the nature of the neighborhood, macro level variables, not individuals. And they claimed that it was this nature of the neighborhood that determined crime rates, not anything to do with individual people. And when they talked about this, they talked about neighborhood organization as being a determining factor in juvenile delinquency. So you might ask, okay, well, what does that mean? What is neighborhood organization? This concept of neighborhood organization, or later on you'll see it referred to as what we call collective efficacy, is really just the ability of a community to come together to solve common problems. That's really what it boils down to. So if we talk about a disorganized neighborhood, we're not talking about that they're messy and they can't keep their stuff looking neat. We're talking about the fact that they don't have the social processes or structure in place to allow responsible people in the community to come together to solve problems. And one of the main problems that we see in these kind of communities is a high number of unsupervised youth just kind of running around in the streets. That has a tendency to lead to very high crime rates in an area, because when it gets right down to it, the youth are really the ones committing most of the crime. If they're unsupervised, then you're going to have a problem. So growing up in a disorganized area, again, a community that cannot solve problems, is characterized by a breakdown of social control, and also these youth get exposed to criminal cultures or subcultures that kind of lure them into lives of crime. And so the combination of these things creates a really high rate of delinquency. Now, so you think about, if you had only one of these things, you might not get a high crime rate. If you had a breakdown of control, but there was no criminal subculture, well, then there's nothing to lure people into it. On the other hand, you might have a criminal subculture, but if you've got high levels of social control, lots of parents keeping track of kids or other interested adults, well, then they can probably keep most of them out of that. But when you get the combination of these two, it creates really high rates of juvenile delinquency. Some of the work that Sean McKay did was based on interviews with some of these juvenile delinquents. And this is called Qualitative Research, where instead of crunching numbers, we examine words. And so they interviewed a lot of these people and kind of compiled these autobiographies into what they called life histories. And what they found through these interviews is that a lot of juveniles were drawn into crime through associations with either older siblings or gang members or delinquent friends. And this concept of disorganization produced criminal traditions that really persisted for a very long time, and these were very difficult types of trends to get people to break out of. So the next question might be, okay, well, we've got this theory, does it work? And actually the answer is that, yeah, it actually works pretty well. In 2005, Pratt and Cohen did what we call a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a study of studies, essentially, where they gather up all of these studies that other people have done to assess whether or not this theory works, and they kind of total them all together to say, all right, what do we know about this theory? And they found that social disorganization variables really were pretty good predictors of crime rates in any given area. One of the studies that's actually pretty famous, at least as famous as you can be in criminology, that was a study done by Sampson and Groves in 1989. And incidentally, if you end up going to graduate school in criminology, you will read both of these studies at some point in your career. But Sampson and Groves did a really pretty good test of social disorganization theory. A lot of the tests that had been done prior to theirs were not really that sound or methodologically rigorous, but they did a really good one and found that that disorganized areas did have higher levels of crime than more organized areas, and that a lot of these structural factors identified by Shaw and McKay were in fact very important in predicting rates of crime in an area. Moving on from social disorganization theory now, we're going to move to Sutherland's theory of differential association. And the work that Shaw and McKay did with these interviews with these juveniles laid the groundwork for the theory that Sutherland came up with, again, which we call differential association theory. And really what Sutherland was looking at is, and again, he was looking more at the individual level now, getting away from the community level. He looked at, you have all these groups in these different areas, and they're organized differently. Some are, because we talk about social disorganization as being, or organization as being strong ties. And what he noticed is that, well, there are some groups that have really strong ties, but they just happen to be organized to support criminal activity. And then there are other groups that are organized to not support criminal activity. So he started looking at these different things and trying to figure out, what mechanisms might be at work there. In Sutherland's differential association theory, he used this concept that he called definitions. And this theory asserts that behavior is learned through social interactions with other people. And the inner city, he said, was characterized by culture conflict between a conventional culture that didn't want to break the law and a criminal culture that kind of did. And so everybody, he said, is exposed to both. And what he said, people would acquire definitions either favorable to or contrary to the commission of crime. And to understand what he was talking about, you could really substitute the word definition for the word belief or attitude. That's really all he was talking about. Is that when he says definitions favorable to the commission of crime, it just means that you believe committing crime is okay. And so he said that what was important is the ratio, because everybody's exposed to both. So if you're exposed to more criminal definitions compared to non-criminal, then you would have a tendency to embrace a life of crime, and then vice versa, going the other way. And so he said these were things that were learned through social interactions with other people, and whichever one of these sets of definitions you got more of would tend to be the way you would go in life. Sutherland had 9 propositions that he articulated as a part of this theory. And I'm going to read them, but I mean, these are important. You need to know these. But this kind of walks you through the theory to kind of get the idea of the whole process that he was talking about. First is that criminal behavior is learned. Sutherland argued that crime is just like any other activity or skill. We usually learn it from someone else. We watch someone else do it, and we say, okay, that's how you do it, and then we can imitate it. And so, number 2, it's learned in interaction with other people in a process of communication. And then number 3, that the principal part of learning of criminal behavior occurs within intimate personal groups. So he said it's not just that you learn it from any old person, it's from the people you associate with closely, your friends, your family mostly. So number 4, he says when the behavior is learned, this includes how to do it, the techniques of committing the crime, and kind of why you do it, the specific direction of motives, drives, rationalizations, and attitudes. So you not only learn how to do it from the people you associate with, but why you do it. And this is, you might grow up in a community that, for example, hates the police. So you might learn that, well, the reason you fight with the police every time they show up is because we hate them. And so, that might be one possibility. But then number 5, the specific direction of the motives and drives is learned from definitions of legal codes as favorable or unfavorable. And all that's really saying is either you learn that the law is a good thing that should be upheld for the maintenance of society's order, or you learn that the law is bad and it's just trying to keep you down and prevent you from having a happy life. And so, people either kind of usually develop this attitude one way or the other, and that kind of determines where they go also. Continuing on, number 6, a person becomes delinquent because of an excess of definitions favorable to the violation of law. I've already explained that. Differential associations may vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity, and that requires a little explanation. Now, this term differential association, all that means is everybody's exposed to a different amount of definitions favorable to or unfavorable to breaking law. That's all it means. So that's the differential part, is that we just all have this different ratio of definitions. Now, when he talks about frequency, he's just talking about, how often do you associate with these people? Because maybe you know a lot of criminals, but you don't really associate with them that often, so that's not really going to have as big of an impact. Duration is how long have you known these people? Is this someone you just met, or have you known this person for 10 or 20 years? Because people you've known longer probably are going to have more of an influence on your thinking than maybe someone you just met yesterday. Priority is, kind of the same thing. It's talking about not just how long the relationship has gone on, but who did you know first? Because maybe you have really long relationships with numerous people, but Sutherland argues that people you know earlier in life probably have more influence over you than people you meet later in life. And so that's what this idea of priority is. And then intensity is just the level of commitment you have to this relationship. Maybe you know some people that you see all the time, you've known them for a long time, you've known them since you were a kid, but you just don't really have that strong of a connection with them. Maybe you wish they weren't even around. So those kinds of relationships, again, Sutherland would argue, are not likely to affect your behavior that much. So again, the types of relationships that Sutherland argued would affect people the most in terms of how they went in life would be people that they saw the most frequently, they've known the longest, they met them early in life, and had very strong relationships or bonds to these people. That's essentially how the theory goes in terms of these relationships. So continuing with these propositions, the process of learning criminal behavior by association with criminal and anti-criminal patterns involves all the mechanisms that are involved in other learning. And all that really means is you learn crime the same way you learn anything else. Someone explains it to you, you watch it, you try it, maybe you try it a couple times, you practice at it, you get better. He just argued that it's really no different than any other skill. And number 9 is actually pretty important because this is, kind of goes to what I was talking about a little bit earlier about poverty and crime. And Sutherland says that while criminal behavior is an expression of needs and values, it is not explained by those needs and values, since non-criminal behavior is not an expression of the same needs and values. Okay, so what does that mean? Essentially, what we could say is, again, some people try to argue, well, poor people commit a lot of crime because they need money. Okay, so what you're saying is that, criminal behavior is a result of the need for money. Well, everybody needs money. most people don't commit crime to get money. And so you cannot say that the need for money explains criminal behavior when there are lots of other non-criminal options that other people choose. And so what he's really saying there is that you can't use these needs and values, the end results of crime, as an explanation for its occurrence. So read that again, think about it, and it'll make sense to you. So looking at this theory that Sutherland came up with, he believed that this was a general theory. And when we say a general theory, that means it explains all crime, all the time, everywhere. And so that's what we mean when we say a general theory. So it's really a pretty ambitious claim when you think about it. But he believed it was a general explanation that could be applied to basically every type of illegal activity. And he even claimed that differential association could account for offenses committed by people of high social standing, even white-collar crime. And again, Sutherland really was kind of one of the pioneers of examining white-collar crime, and he claimed that this theory was the theory that would apply. And we're not going to talk a lot about white-collar crime because you can take the white-collar crime class and get all of that. But this is where a lot of that Sutherland's work in that area branches from. Okay, moving to a little bit different concept now. If you remember when we talked about social disorganization, Sampson, who was one of the researchers that did that 1989 study, kind of came up with this term that we call collective efficacy. And this is a term that was used, it's kind of the opposite of social disorganization. And this idea of collective efficacy really just meant that, again, that the community did have the resources to come together and solve problems. There were strong networks and social ties and strong social control. This idea, and this is kind of maybe a little bit of a sideline theory, but a systemic theory, basically said that neighborhoods were characterized by these systems of social networks and ties. And when they were dense and strong, then there was strong social control, or strong informal social control. And when they're weak, then you had this lack of social control that would lead to higher crime rates. Bursick and Grasmick were another couple of researchers that talked about this idea of collective efficacy, and they really characterized like 3 levels of community control. And again, keep in mind, this is mostly informal types of control. When we say informal control, we're talking about residents of a neighborhood kind of keeping each other in check. Formal social control would be things like the police and the courts, actual government intervention. But informal social control is important because if you have high levels of informal social control, the police might not ever have to get called, or at least not as much as they would somewhere else. But what Bursick and Grasmick talked about, private levels of control, and this is intimate relationships among family and friends. Maybe doing something or not doing something because you don't want to upset your wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, things like that. Parochial levels of control are those met during daily routines and voluntary organizations. So like maybe your church group or something like that. And then there were public levels of control, relationships with external groups that provide resources to maintaining order. And Bursick and Grasmick argued that organized communities would have all 3 of these, while disorganized communities would not. So there's really just one problem with this systemic model that we've talked about. It's one of the problems in some of this early research is that it was always kind of assumed that strong ties would always lead to lower levels of crime, and that's not necessarily always the case. But high crime communities often have neighbors that know each other and have really strong ties, and yet those tend to be the communities that have high levels of crime. While there are a lot of low crime areas that have really weak social ties. There are a lot of wealthy areas and wealthy communities where people don't really know each other at all. They pretty much keep to themselves. They don't really, they just do their own thing. They're busy, they're working, and they don't really know anybody. But those tend to be areas sometimes that have the lowest levels of crime. So, only looking at this idea of strong social ties doesn't really necessarily work every time. So, because of some of these weaknesses, we had to. Some researchers recharacterized this social disorganization framework, and came up with this term collective efficacy. And so then they defined social cohesion among neighbors as a combination of willingness to intervene on the behalf of the common good, with the social ties. So you might have a neighborhood with strong social ties, but if no one's willing to intervene on behalf of the community good, then it doesn't really matter. The social tie doesn't really do anything for you then. And think about this in terms of maybe the neighborhood where you grew up. At least I know where I grew up. There were always adults in the neighborhood who were more than willing to call out some of the neighborhood kids on doing something stupid, and maybe get in touch with their parents and say, hey, here's what I found your kid doing. And those are the kind of neighborhoods that usually do pretty well in terms of keeping the youth in check, because everybody's kind of watching everybody else's kids. Some neighborhoods nowadays you don't have that, where kids kind of run rampant. People may see it, but they don't want to get involved, they don't want to intervene, it's not their business, whatever. Those are the neighborhoods where you tend to have a lot of problems. So in neighborhoods where this cohesiveness prevails, residents can kind of depend on each other to enforce rules, not just for their own groups, but for other people they see wandering around the neighborhood as well. Just like crime, collective efficacy is not evenly distributed across neighborhoods. It's, again, just like crime, you kind of have pockets where it works really well, and then other areas where it doesn't work so well. And this has really been offered as one of the explanations, or one of the key explanations, as to why urban neighborhoods are so different in terms of their levels of criminal behavior. There's just this lack of collective efficacy, where really no one wants to get involved. You don't have this cohesiveness of people in the neighborhood, and that's why crime rates tend to be so high. So looking at some of these disorganized neighborhoods, another branch of theoretical work that came out of this was a study of cultural deviance, which was, and again, this is a whole kind of branch of theory, but one of the most noted studies in this area was one done by Elijah Anderson. And there's actually a book that he wrote detailing this study, and it's called Code of the Street. And it was done in an inner city neighborhood, I believe in Philadelphia. And basically he just spent a couple of years just kind of, I don't think he lived there, but he spent a lot of time in this neighborhood, got to know the residents, talked to people, interviewed them, and wrote this whole book about the processes he observed as to why these neighborhoods had so many problems. And what he found, kind of what he argued in the end, is that this code of the street is kind of an informal set of rules that values violence and kind of governs the decisions people make as they go through their life. And really the main term they use in the book is respect, and they probably don't really mean respect, they probably just mean they want people to be afraid of them. But essentially this street code was characterized by things like, if someone showed you disrespect in some way or whatever, then you had to respond with violence. And if you didn't, you would be seen as weak, and then you become a target for further insult or violence. And so, any insult, but especially violence, would always have to be met with violence, to show that you weren't afraid to stand up for yourself. So in looking at the families that lived in these depressed neighborhoods, Anderson came up with two terms. He either classified families as street families or decent families. And the decent families were the ones who were trying to keep their kids away from violence, have them do good in school, maybe have a job, earn money, and kind of, stick with the traditional norms of society. Street families were the ones that basically just didn't do all that. Parents may have had some, criminal activity going on, and they taught it to their kids, or maybe there was no influence from the parents, and the kids just hang out with the gangs or whatever. But that's kind of how he divided these families up in terms of a typology that you could wrap your head around. But again, just as I kind of already explained, what he found in his study was that there's this code that demands that any disrespect be met with an immediate threat or application of violence. But this didn't just affect street families, it affected everybody that lived there. And so even the decent families in an impoverished neighborhood had to kind of adapt to this a little bit too, even though they might not have necessarily agreed with it. So the use that came from all the families in these economically depressed areas really had to kind of live by this code of the street, or they would become targets and kind of suffer the consequences. So this code of the street is seen as a cultural adaptation to the prevailing conditions in a community. And unfortunately, it's an adaptation that it just has a high propensity for someone to become involved in criminal activity and to end up getting arrested or whatever because of these acts of violence that they engage in on a regular basis. Now, one of the problems with this theory is that it's hard to test. So that there really have not been a lot of empirical tests of this study. I have seen some studies that have tried to test some of these ideas, and actually it's kind of interesting some of the findings that have come out because again, this code of the street adaptation is thought to reduce the level of victimization that someone experiences, because if you're seen as tough and people respect you, you should be less of a target. But some studies actually have found just the opposite, that the more a person adopts this code of the street, the more likely they are to be a target of violence. So it's really kind of discouraging that here's this adaptation that people have adopted as a way to try and survive in this environment that they live in, and it actually ends up making it more difficult for them to survive, even though they may not necessarily believe that or think that. But again, there are mixed results on some of these studies. But there have been some pretty compelling studies that show that that the adoption of this code of the street is actually increases risk of victimization. So now we're going to move to social learning theory, and this is a theory that was developed by Ron Akers. And in order to understand social learning theory, you first absolutely have to understand differential association theory, because social learning theory was really just an extension of differential association. So we've already talked about differential association, so you should basically understand how that works. And what Akers said was, well, yeah, that's interesting. You've identified maybe one way people learn these things, but his problem with differential association was that it didn't really identify any of the mechanisms at work that actually caused people to engage in these behaviors and to actually adopt, the criminal lifestyle. Beyond, because you can't just say, well, because you're hanging out with criminals, then you're a criminal too. He wanted to identify, well, what is it that actually makes that happen? And so really there are four central concepts that social learning incorporates. One is this concept of differential association, so that's important. And then there's imitation, and then he also adopted this idea of definitions, and really these first three really come from differential association theory, because Sutherland talked about imitation and he talked about definitions. So Akers' primary contribution is this fourth concept of differential social reinforcement. And this is mainly tied to just rewards and punishments for different behaviors. And that's what determines what we will engage in and what we won't. And this is a term that's kind of borrowed from operant psychology. And he used that to develop social learning theory as an extension of differential association. Okay, so looking at the main concepts of social learning theory, in addition to these definitions that people acquire, they can also become involved in crime through just imitation. They just see someone else do it, maybe they look up to that person, and so they copy their behavior. Definitions and imitation are really most instrumental, Akers argued, in determining your initial involvement in crime. So you might get definitions, and you might, maybe want to imitate someone, and that kind of is what entices you into trying it out for the first time. So what Akers wanted to explain is, well, once someone tries crime, what is it that either makes them continue to do it, or to say, you know what, I don't want to do that anymore, that wasn't very good. And he said it's this idea of social reinforcement that determines whether a behavior is repeated. And so there are a lot of terms that we use for this that you may see. Differential social reinforcement is one. Differential rewards and punishments. Those are some of the main ones you may see. But again, this is just the idea that we tend to do things that we are rewarded for, and we tend to not do things that we're punished for. That's all this really means. And so this was the mechanism that he used to explain why we would do something or not after we tried it out for the first time. So what Akers argued is that once we engage in some behavior, whatever it is, if we're rewarded for it, we're likely to do it again. If we're punished for it, we might not be so likely to do it again. And so the stronger and more persistent the rewards are for some behavior, or let's say for criminal behavior, the more likely it is to persist. So then you might say, well, what are the rewards of criminal behavior? Well, maybe you do something where you get a lot of money and you didn't get caught, so you think, okay, that was cool, I'll do it again. More often, what researchers find is that the kinds of reinforcement people get for criminal behavior tends to be more social than material. So let's say you're part of a gang, and you go and, shoot some holes through a gang member's house. So you go back and tell your gang, hey, look what I did. And they praise you for it. And so, wow, it was really awesome. You got the rival gang. And so that's a form of reinforcement. It's a reward. And so when people are rewarded in that way and they get social acceptance, that might be something that matters to them a lot. And so even if someone, say, commits a crime and they get caught by the police and arrested, and maybe they even go to prison, and this is one of the problems with deterrence theory, is that it's logical to think, oh, well, if you put someone in prison, they won't ever want to do that again, and so they won't commit crime. Well, in a lot of criminal subcultures, going to prison is seen as a mark of honor. It's like you've done your time, you've done the deal, you're a real, criminal or whatever. And so going and doing some prison time may actually produce more social reinforcement that is stronger than the punishment aspect of going to prison. And so that's what this whole idea of social learning is all about, that we get rewarded and punished sometimes for the same behavior. So the question is, well, which one is stronger, the pull of the reward or the negative thing of the punishment? And so you have to kind of examine this idea of differential rewards pretty closely to try and figure out what's going on here. So looking at social learning, you might ask, well, does this theory work? And the answer is yes, it does. And what you'll find in criminology is that most of the theories we talk about, work to a certain extent. Nothing predicts crime 100% perfectly, but we have developed several theories that use different concepts to predict criminal behavior. Social learning theory is probably one of the most researched and most empirically supported theories that we have in criminology right now. It's not without its weaknesses, but the variables that Akers identified in this idea of differential rewards and punishments really is a pretty strong predictor of the behaviors people will engage in. And so, but one of the criticisms of this theory, and this really goes to a criticism of differential association as well, since they kind of are all involved together, is that it's not really 100% decided in criminology if delinquent friends cause you to become criminal, or if you find delinquent friends because you're criminal. So you see the causation could run either direction. Of course, social learning would argue that delinquent friends cause criminal behavior. But it could just be that a lot of criminal people get together because they have common goals and interests, and then they commit crime because they just happen to all be criminals. So, it's not really entirely decided if, which way that causal arrow runs, and there's probably some of both going on. But you have to understand that criticism when you talk about these things, because you can't just say as a blanket statement, having delinquent friends will cause you to become delinquent. It's not entirely 100% true. Maybe you're a delinquent and you just seek out delinquent friends, and then you guys go commit a bunch of criminal acts just because that's the kind of people that you are. It has nothing to do with who you're hanging out with. So you have to understand that weakness in the theory. To wrap this up, we'll talk about some policy implications, because like we said at the beginning of the course, theory doesn't really do us any good unless we can apply it to the real world somehow. And in criminology, theoretical exercises usually result in trying to figure out what kind of policies we can implement to reduce crime or improve society in some other way. So Shaw and McKay, their work would say you need to reorganize communities. That communities are just developing in such a way that they cause crime to kind of concentrate in certain areas. The Chicago School would say we need to reverse this process of criminal learning, and that goes along with differential association and social learning theory. Which really, if you're going to argue that it's your social interactions that cause you to become delinquent, then the natural policy would be we need to get those people out of that situation and put them somewhere else where they can learn something better. And that's where you see programs like maybe the Big Brother, Big Sister program, where youths are assigned to an adult mentor, and this is to give them a role model where they can hopefully gain definitions that are favorable to not breaking the law, and learn a different way to live. And so those are the kinds of programs and policies that have grown out of these theories. Some other changes in the community that people have talked about is, again, eradicating some of the problems that lie within disorganized communities. Just negative stereotypes people have, attitudes they have about, how the world works. These are difficult things to change because you can't really change the way a whole community thinks overnight, or even over a long period of time. But again, there have been a lot of programs that are aimed at trying to do that, and your book details more than we're going to talk about here. But Shaw, from Disorganization theory, established the Chicago Area Project, which was kind of a group that served as a creator of neighborhood community programs in these disorganized areas. And your book lists several of the programs that they implemented. You can read about them. I'm not going to talk about them here. But again, you have to credit him. He didn't only just do research, but once he found some ideas that he thought were important in terms of improving these communities, he translated them into policies and programs and took steps to implement them to try and improve the neighborhoods and the slum areas. Just to conclude, the Chicago School, which again is all these people we've kind of talked about, elevated kind of sociological concerns to the forefront over individual trait explanations of crime. And for a long time, these macro-level theories were very dominant in terms of explaining criminal behavior. Micro-level theories, which are individual-level theories, kind of became popular again later. But even today, these macro-level theories are still very prominent in criminological research and in formulating policies to reduce crime. And there also were some methodological advances that came out of this research, regardless of whether you like the theories or not. It did show the value for the first time of mapping crime, because prior to this work, there was kind of this sense that crime clustered in areas, but a lot of people still held to the idea that, well, even though there are certain areas that are maybe a little worse than others, that maybe crime just is kind of evenly distributed through the community. And you can see by mapping crime, actually, that is not true. Crime is not evenly distributed throughout communities. And it also showed the value of qualitative methods, because Sean McKay, if you remember, did those qualitative interviews with youth that started to kind of tease out what some of these mechanisms were that were at work. And it was that work that enabled Sutherland to develop some of his theories, which in turn led to Akers developing social learning theory, which is a very widely accepted theory today. So keep in mind some of those research methods as being valuable as well. But that wraps up this chapter. If you have any questions, get in touch with me, and I'll talk to you soon.